a thing that comes into it from having read the book a few times. You read the book a few times and it's just like the resurrection of the Christ.
Imagine if one of the world's oldest surviving Bibles has been preserving a message about humanity's final days for centuries, one that much of the world has never truly encountered. It wasn't hidden inside a forbidden chamber or protected by impossible riddles. Instead, it has quietly remained in a place that few people ever think to explore. Before we uncover this extraordinary mystery, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you're fascinated by hidden biblical history, ancient manuscripts, and the mysteries that most people have never heard about, you're in the right place, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Interest in this remarkable collection of scriptures grew after filmmaker and actor Mel Gibson spoke about the Ethiopian Bible, an ancient biblical tradition that differs significantly from the version familiar to most Christians today. While the Bible commonly used in the West contains 66 books, the Ethiopian canon includes more than 80, preserving several ancient writings that were never accepted into the Western biblical canon. For countless generations, these sacred texts have been carefully protected inside Ethiopian churches and monasteries, where monks preserved them as priceless spiritual treasures. Among these writings are the books of Enoch and Jubilees, ancient works filled with mysterious visions, spiritual warnings, and descriptions of events said to occur before great changes sweep across the world. So why are people paying attention to these writings now? According to Gibson, several passages found within these ancient books seem to describe patterns of moral decay, worldwide instability, and growing spiritual confusion that appear strikingly similar to what many people believe they are witnessing today. Rather than presenting only a dramatic ending, these texts describe a period of awakening, a time when long-hidden truths begin emerging and humanity is forced to examine the path it has chosen. It's like uncovering an older version of a map that reveals details everyone assumed had been missing forever. And if these ancient scriptures truly contain additional insight into the future, an even bigger question naturally follows. Have we been reading only part of the story this entire time? If you enjoy uncovering forgotten history, ancient mysteries, and fascinating biblical traditions, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future discoveries. Now let's take a closer look at the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and the extraordinary writings it has safeguarded for centuries. For nearly 2,000 years, Christians across the world have heard the familiar account of Jesus' resurrection. After being crucified, he rose from the dead, appeared to his disciples, and delivered his final message of hope before ascending into heaven. Yet Ethiopia has preserved ancient Christian writings that tell a much richer, and to many far more unsettling, account of what happened during those 40 days after the resurrection, a story that remains unfamiliar to much of the Western world. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church possesses one of the oldest and most complete biblical traditions still preserved today. Alongside the books recognized by most Christian denominations, its scriptures contain several ancient writings that never became part of the Roman Church's biblical canon. According to tradition, these texts preserve teachings Jesus shared with his followers after his resurrection. Within their pages is a prophecy concerning humanity's final age, one that reaches far beyond the warnings recorded in the book of Revelation. Generation after generation, Ethiopian monks devoted themselves to protecting these manuscripts. In peaceful monasteries, they painstakingly copied every word by hand, ensuring that these teachings would survive the passing centuries. To them, these writings were never simply historical records or theological reflections. They believed they carried urgent messages intended for people living in the distant future. According to these ancient accounts, before leaving the world, Jesus described the conditions humanity would eventually face. He spoke of a future era when people's spirits would weaken, truth would slowly be replaced by endless distraction and entertainment, and individuals who appeared righteous on the outside would ignore the suffering of the poor, the forgotten, and the vulnerable. These were not comforting promises meant to reassure his followers. They were solemn warnings designed to prepare future generations for what was still to come. Among the Ethiopian writings, one manuscript receives special attention above the others. It is known as the Book of the Covenant. Ancient tradition says this book preserves conversations Jesus shared with his disciples during the 40 days between his resurrection and his ascension into heaven. What makes this text especially compelling is the way it describes humanity's final era. According to its message, the end does not begin with sudden catastrophe or flames consuming the earth. Instead, Jesus describes a far quieter and perhaps even more dangerous beginning. It starts with the slow disappearance of the human conscience. He speaks of a generation that proudly carries his name, repeats his teachings, and constructs magnificent places of worship in his honor, yet fails to understand the very heart of his message. The churches may remain crowded, but the living spirit of genuine faith quietly fades away. The prophecy grows even more alarming as it turns its attention to deceptive leaders. According to these ancient writings, deception will not arrive only through obvious enemies or distant nations. Instead, it will emerge from within the very institutions established in Christ's name. The prophecy warns that some religious leaders will preach about heaven while secretly pursuing influence, wealth, and earthly authority. Jesus says that whenever his teachings are twisted to excuse violence, defend greed, or ignore those who suffer, humanity is moving closer to a dangerous turning point. The prophecy then shifts its attention to the natural world. Jesus speaks of powerful earthquakes, rising seas, and unusual signs appearing in the heavens, events so extraordinary that even the wisest people will struggle to understand them. Yet these happenings are not presented simply as acts of judgment. Instead, they are compared to the first labor pains before the birth of something entirely new. According to these writings, creation itself begins responding to what is about to unfold. Then comes perhaps the most sobering warning of all. Jesus tells his followers not to fear the shaking of the earth nearly as much as the hardening of the human heart. The greatest danger, he explains, is the day people become so emotionally and spiritually numb that compassion no longer reaches them. The Didascalia and the Final Empire. Another ancient Ethiopian text, often identified as the Didascalia, expands this prophecy even further. It describes Jesus warning his disciples about a final empire, unlike any kingdom before it, a system of control so immense and so subtle that most people would spend their entire lives inside it without realizing they were imprisoned. According to the prophecy, this empire will not rely on chains or visible oppression. Instead, it will keep people comfortable. It will offer food, entertainment, convenience, and security while convincing them that comfort itself is freedom. The text continues with a striking blessing. Blessed are those who recognize the cage and still choose love. Blessed are those who hunger for truth in an age overflowing with false abundance. These same writings also paint a remarkable picture of what the final days will feel like from within. Jesus says his voice will once again be heard, but not from places of wealth or authority. It will rise from deserts, prisons, forgotten communities, and from people the powerful refuse to notice. His spirit, the prophecy says, will speak through the overlooked, the rejected, and the humble. Then comes one of the prophecy's most unsettling ideas. Those who are most convinced they are prepared for the end will be the very ones who fail to recognize it when it arrives. Why Ethiopia preserved these ancient writings? To understand why these texts survived, it is important to understand Ethiopia's unique place in Christian history. Christianity reached Ethiopia during the 4th century, where it developed independently for many generations. Because the Ethiopian Church remained largely separated from the influence of Rome, it continued preserving books and traditions that were never included in Western Christianity. That separation allowed Ethiopian believers to safeguard a broader collection of ancient writings, many of which contain deeply mystical teachings connected to Jesus and the final age. Within these texts, the end times are not portrayed merely as worldwide disasters or political upheaval. Instead, they describe an intense spiritual conflict taking place within every individual. The greatest battle of the last days is not fought by armies or weapons. It is fought inside the human heart. According to these writings, every person must choose between truth and comfort, between awakening to reality or remaining peacefully trapped inside familiar illusions. Some Ethiopian scholars and believers have suggested several reasons these writings never became widely accepted throughout the Western Church. One explanation centers on authority. They argue that church leaders may have favored teachings that encourage believers to depend primarily on religious institutions for guidance, a message suggesting that God's truth could also reach ordinary people, especially the poor, humble, and forgotten, might have challenged that established structure. Another reason involves the mystical nature of these texts. Their pages describe heavenly assemblies, prophetic visions, and sweeping timelines that extend beyond ordinary history. Throughout different periods, such themes were often viewed with caution and in some cases dismissed as dangerous or controversial. Others believe a simpler explanation may exist if these messages were understood literally. They might lead people to believe that the final age described by the prophecies was not some distant future, but a reality already beginning to unfold. The 4 stages of the final age. Several Ethiopian writings claim that Jesus outlined 4 distinct stages leading toward humanity's final era. The first is called the Age of Forgetting, when people gradually abandon the search for truth. The second is the Age of Spectacle, when endless distraction and entertainment replace wisdom and understanding. The third is the Age of the False Shepherd, when corrupt leaders invoke God's name while using faith as a tool for power and control. The fourth and final stage is the one that many researchers find most unsettling. It is known simply as the Great Silence. It is not a silence filled with peace or comfort. It is a silence of the soul, a time when the bond between heaven and humanity becomes so faint that even sincere seekers struggle to sense it. Yet Jesus says this silence does not last forever. According to these writings, at the darkest point of the Great Silence, a fire will appear once again, not to consume the earth, but to awaken it one final time. The Ethiopian texts conclude with a statement that they present as one of Jesus' most profound teachings. He declares that the end is not the end of life itself, it is the end of deception. Those who remain faithful to truth and love, even while the world chooses comfort, influence, and power, will not be forgotten. They will be recognized not by crowns of honor, but by the scars they carry from remaining faithful. The seven seals of the heart. Among the most fascinating ideas preserved in these Ethiopian writings is a teaching known as the seven seals of the heart. Unlike the seals described in the book of Revelation, these are not connected to catastrophic events or supernatural judgments. Instead, they represent the hidden spiritual barriers that exist within every human being. The prophecy suggests that the greatest battle of the last days is fought inside the human heart. The first barrier is called the seal of comfort. It describes the moment people reject difficult truths simply because they disturb their sense of security. Rather than growing through discomfort, they cling to familiar beliefs. The second is the seal of pride. Here, a person becomes convinced they already possess all the answers. Once certainty replaces humility, the desire to learn, question, or reflect quietly disappears. When every decision is driven by the need for safety, people may abandon truth altogether if it threatens their comfort or security. The fourth is known as the seal of distraction. In this condition, every moment of silence is replaced with entertainment, endless activity, or constant noise, leaving no room for reflection or the quiet voice of the Spirit. This occurs when people surround themselves only with opinions that reinforce their own beliefs, creating an environment where genuine truth struggles to enter. Next comes the seal of false mercy. Here, forgiveness becomes an excuse for refusing to grow. Instead of inspiring transformation, mercy is misunderstood as permission to remain unchanged. The seventh and final barrier is described as the most dangerous of all. It is the seal of religion. According to the text, this happens when sacred traditions, religious language, and outward rituals continue to exist, while authentic faith has quietly disappeared beneath them. The prophecy says that when a person breaks through all seven of these inner seals, something extraordinary takes place. Rather than waiting for a heavenly sign, that individual becomes the very spark of awakening the world has been waiting to see. The prophecy of the final witness. Across the Christian world, believers know the familiar story. Jesus was betrayed, suffered, was crucified, and gave his life for humanity's salvation. That account has been preserved for centuries in churches, scripture, sacred art, and stained glass windows across the globe. Yet the Ethiopian tradition preserves another layer to the story. According to some of its oldest manuscripts, before ascending into heaven, Jesus entrusted his disciples with one final revelation, a prophecy that, according to these writings, was never preserved in the Western biblical tradition. Known by some Ethiopian scholars as the prophecy of the final witness, this message offers an unflinching vision of humanity's last days. Rather than describing the end in vague language, it portrays a specific spiritual condition and the generation that will experience it. According to the prophecy, the final witness is not a single angel, miracle, or cosmic sign. It is an ordinary generation of men and women who choose to stand for truth during humanity's darkest hour. Jesus says these people will not receive honor from the powerful. Instead, they will be ridiculed, silenced, and pushed aside by the institutions of their own age. Yet their message will still reach those prepared to hear it, not through grand stages or positions of influence, not through crowds or public applause, but quietly, within the hearts of those searching for truth. Jesus tells his disciples that they should never fear losing their public voice because truth does not depend on a platform to remain alive. Some Ethiopian theologians argue that the absence of this prophecy from the Western biblical tradition was not simply the result of history. According to this viewpoint, the decisions surrounding the First Council of Nicaea played a significant role in shaping which writings became part of the canon used by much of Christianity. These scholars suggest that writings portraying corruption arising from within religious institutions were viewed as deeply controversial. According to this interpretation, prophecies warning that false spiritual leaders could appear wearing symbols of faith and exercising religious authority would have been among the most difficult teachings for church leaders to preserve. According to this perspective, while these teachings gradually disappeared from much of the Christian world, Ethiopia continued to preserve them across the centuries. Ethiopia, the keeper of ancient traditions. Ethiopia occupies a remarkable place in history. Recognized as one of the world's oldest civilizations, its story stretches back thousands of years. Despite invasions, changing kingdoms, and centuries of political upheaval, the nation succeeded in protecting something few civilizations have managed to preserve: its cultural identity, its religious heritage, and many of its oldest sacred traditions. Unlike most African countries, Ethiopia was never permanently colonized by a foreign empire. As a result, many ancient customs, religious practices, and historic manuscripts remained largely untouched by outside influence. For countless Ethiopians, their homeland represents far more than a geographic location. It is woven deeply into the biblical story itself. Some long-standing traditions trace the origins of the Ethiopian people to Ham, one of Noah's sons, a belief that also appears in several ancient Jewish traditions. Whether viewed historically or spiritually, these connections have led many believers to see Ethiopia as a living bridge between the modern world and the earliest pages of biblical history. Faith has long stood at the center of Ethiopian life. Christianity reached the region during the 4th century, and unlike places where religions spread primarily through conquest or political authority, it gradually became part of the nation's culture and identity. Over generations, the Ethiopian people embraced Christianity as a treasure worth protecting. By the 6th century, travelers were already describing Ethiopia as a thriving Christian kingdom. One of the best-known visitors, Cosmas Indicopleustes, wrote about a society where Christian faith shaped everyday life. His writings also describe Ethiopian rulers offering refuge to Christians escaping persecution elsewhere, providing them with safety and a new beginning. Perhaps the most extraordinary part of Ethiopia's legacy is its biblical tradition. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church safeguards one of the world's oldest and most complete biblical traditions. While most modern Bibles contain 66 books, the Ethiopian canon preserves many additional ancient texts, including the books of Enoch and Jubilees, works that disappeared from most Western traditions centuries ago. Many of these manuscripts were written in Ge'ez, an ancient Ethiopian language understood by only a small number of scholars today. As a result, these writings remained largely unknown outside Ethiopia for generations. Thanks to its long history, enduring Christian faith, and careful preservation of sacred manuscripts, Ethiopia has become known as a guardian of ancient biblical traditions. This remarkable legacy raises an intriguing question. Could some of history's oldest spiritual teachings and perhaps forgotten insights about humanity's future have been quietly preserved in Ethiopia all along?